Good evening, lovers of history and the world's strange turning points. Tonight I want to invite you into a room that smells of smoke, wet wool, and patience. A Norse longhouse in late autumn. The fire licks at iron hooks. Outside, the light is already thinning, as if the sun itself is rationing. In the corner, barrels breathe quietly, wood staves swelling with brine, while strings of fish hang like pale flags in the rafters. We often meet the Vikings at the dramatic moment, the prow cutting black water, shields flashing, a shoreline about to learn a new word for fear. But raids are the loud part of a much quieter machinery. The real power of the Viking world, its travel, its wars, its settlement of harsh coasts, depended on something less glamorous than axes, calories that could survive months when the land turned hard and the sea turned dangerous. A chieftain may boast about glory, but his private dread is simpler. If his household runs out of food, he doesn't just lose weight, he loses loyalty. Let the hall go hungry, he thinks, and my name will taste sour in every mouth. Winter is not a season here, it's a tribunal. So our story is not about a single conqueror. It's about a system of storage, drying, smoking, fermenting, salting, and burying. A technology of time. Because every bite in February was decided in September. In Scandinavia's north and along the North Atlantic, the calendar was a kind of battlefield map. There were weeks for haymaking, weeks for slaughter, weeks for fishing runs, and weeks for preserving. Miss the window and you didn't merely spoil meat, you invited sickness, weakness, and the slow collapse of a household standing. Even the law codes and the village assemblies, the things, took hunger seriously, because hunger turns neighbors into rivals faster than any feud. Listen closely and you can hear the season shifting, the creak of a storehouse door, the hiss when salt touches fresh blood, the dull thud of a sealable lid. These sounds are logistics. They are strategy. And before we step out into the cold and follow the work that feeds a winter, remember this, the Vikings didn't store food to survive long winters. They stored food to keep choices alive. The next choice is already being made, with a knife, on a chopping block, in the light of a shortening day. Step outside with me. The air bites cleanly, and your breath hangs a moment before the wind tears it away. A farmstead sits on a rise above a fjord, timber walls, turf roof, a byre where animals breathe steam into the dark. Nearby, a small storehouse stands on posts, lifted from damp ground and clever rodents, its door barred as if it contains treasure. In a way, it does. For most Norse families, the year is built around the winter that is coming. Their wealth isn't measured only in silver arm rings, but in hay stacked high enough to keep cattle alive, in grain kept dry, in fish hardened into travel rations, in butter sealed away from air. The Viking Age, roughly late 8th to 11th centuries, coincides with a comparatively mild climate in parts of the North Atlantic, yet mild here still means storms that can strand boats and ice that can trap a valley in silence. Inside the longhouse, routines are both domestic and defensive. Someone mends a net by firelight, someone checks a barrel for mold, someone listens for the squeak of a mouse. The smell is layered, sour milk, smoke, dried seaweed used as fuel, and the faint sweetness of stored grain. A thrall, an enslaved worker, moves quietly, because food is power, and power has sharp edges. A farmer's wife, the one who truly runs the household's calendar, feels her own private pressure. If the stores fail, she thinks, they will blame my hands, not the weather. It isn't just hunger she fears, it's the humiliation of being called careless at the next gathering, of watching neighbors' eyes drift toward her children's ribs. So the farm becomes a workshop of preservation, and every method has a price. Salt must be bought or traded for, smoke requires wood, fermentation demands clean vessels and attention. And in a world where a missed harvest can tilt a family into dependency, even a simple barrel is political. Because soon, the fjord will freeze at its edges, and the choices about what to eat will narrow to what was saved. On the coast, the work begins with sound, gulls complaining, oars knocking, knives tapping rhythm into wood. A fishing boat noses in, and the catch spills out, cod, haddock, herring, slick and shining, still carrying the sea's cold. Hands move fast, because time is already stealing flavor. Fish are split, gutted, and rinsed, the air fills with iron and salt water, and the deck becomes a bright, slippery battlefield. Drying is the North's quiet miracle. In places like northern Norway, cold wind and low insects make it possible to air-dry fish into what later ages call stockfish, hard as board, light enough to travel, rich enough to keep a body working. Hung on wooden racks, the fillets stiffen day by day, turning from fresh meat into durable protein. No fire, no salt required, just the right climate, and vigilance. A sudden warm spell can invite rot, a careless cut can invite worms. Merchants understand this like priests understand sin. A trader running cargo south toward towns and markets, Birka, Hedeby, Dublin, York, knows that dried fish is more than food, it is currency. If my bundles spoil, he thinks, I arrive as a liar, not a businessman. Reputation travels faster than ships, and a stink clings longer than a storm. Zoom out and you see a supply chain, not a romantic saga. Coastal communities specialize. Inland farms trade hides or iron for fish they cannot catch. The dried slabs feed sailors at sea, workers in winter, even armies on campaign. When Scandinavian ships push into the Atlantic, toward Iceland, Greenland, and beyond, light, storable food becomes the difference between settlement and grave. Now listen to the racks in the wind, a faint creak, like bones settling. That sound is a promise that the sea can be carried into January. In some households the dried fish is pounded, soaked, stewed, softened back into something almost fresh, while the bones are kept for broth, because waste is a luxury the North doesn't indulge. But fish alone cannot hold a haul together, and the next question rises with the smoke from the hearth: what happens when it's time to store the animal that can't be hung from a rack? Before the first real snow, you'll find the sweetest sound on a Norse farm, milk hitting a wooden bucket in warm, steady pulses. Cows, goats, sheep, each animal is a walking pantry, but only if the pantry can outlast the season. Fresh milk is generous and cruel, it turns quickly. So the Vikings, like many northern peoples, lean on transformation. They make time edible. In the longhouse, a pot is kept near the edge of the fire, never quite boiling, never quite cool. Curds form, and someone strains them through cloth. The result can be a thick cultured dairy, something like skyr in later Icelandic tradition, dense with protein, tart on the tongue, friendly to winter when little else is. Whey is not thrown away, it is saved, soured, and used again, a sharp liquid that can preserve or flavor other foods. In a world without refrigeration, acidity is an ally. Butter is another kind of survival. Churned until it separates, then salted and packed tight, it becomes portable fat, fuel for bodies and for status. A guest offered butter in winter knows he is being honored. The storage itself is careful, covered crocks, cool corners, sometimes a cellar-like space under turf where the temperature stays steady and the air smells of earth and damp wood. A household's matron feels a familiar tug inside her chest as she tastes a batch. Too thin, she worries, and will be scraping bowls by midwinter. Yet she also fears being too strict now, denying children and workers the strength they need for autumn labor. Provisioning is always an argument between today and tomorrow, fought with spoons. Zoom out and you see why dairy matters for expansion. When ships leave home, hard cheese and butter travel better than milk. When settlers arrive on a new shore, animals and dairy skills let them copy home in an alien landscape. But the real test of preservation is coming, and it arrives on a day when the yard is slick with blood and the air tastes metallic. The slaughter season opens its door, quietly, and it doesn't close easily. There is a particular silence that falls before slaughter. Not peaceful, practical. The animals have been fed on summer grass and autumn hay, and now they stand close in the byre, warm breath rising, unaware of the arithmetic about to be done. Outside, the ground is cold enough to slow spoilage, and that is no accident. Timing is everything. A knife flashes. Steam billows as hot blood hits cold air. Someone holds a bowl beneath the cut, because blood is not waste, it is thickened into food, mixed with grain or fat, stretched into sausages or puddings. The smell is immediate: iron, hay, smoke from the fire kept ready for scalding and singeing. Children are sent away, or told to watch and learn, depending on the household's nerve. Meat must be divided with almost legal precision. The best cuts are eaten fresh during the days of work and communal feasting that follow. The rest begins its journey into the future. Some is salted, if salt can be spared. Some is smoked in the rafters where the hearth's slow breath keeps insects away and adds a dark sweetness. Some is dried in thin strips, becoming travel food for hunters and sailors. Fat is rendered into lard or tallow, then stored because fat is winter's currency, calories that keep hands steady and tempers calm when daylight is scarce. A steward in a chieftain's hall carries his own private anxiety. If I misjudge, he thinks, the warriors will grumble, the guests will notice, and my lord will blame me before he blames fate. Provisioning is reputation management with knives. Zoom out and you see a hierarchy of preservation. Smoking needs wood, and wood is labor. Salting needs salt, and salt is trade. Drying needs the right air. Even the shape of a longhouse, smoke drifting through rafters, meat hanging above, becomes part of the technology. And yet the whole system has a weak point you can taste on your lips: salt itself. Not everyone has enough of it. So as barrels are sealed and hooks are filled, another journey begins beyond the farmstead, toward coastlines, markets, and the dangerous business of bringing preservation home. A winter barrel begins long before the barrel is filled. In a market town the air smells of tar, sweat, horse dung, and something sharp that catches in the throat: salt. It sits in sacks like pale sand, precious enough that hands dip in carefully, as if touching it too boldly might anger the gods. A trader measures it with practiced boredom, but his eyes never stop calculating. Salt is not evenly gifted across the Viking world. Some coasts can make small amounts by boiling seawater in pans, but fuel is costly and the yield is low. Much of the salt that truly changes a household's prospects comes through exchange, from southern shores, from river routes, from contact with the Frankish world and the wider European economy. When Norse ships raid or trade, they don't just bring back silver, they bring back preservation itself. A local leader knows this and feels the familiar itch of control. If I can command the salt, he thinks, I can command the winter. He sets rules, collects dues, offers protection at the docks, a sort of early PR spin that turns power into inevitability. The poor pay in labor and obedience, the wealthy pay in coin and then charge others twice. In the longhouse, salt becomes a decision. Use more now to secure meat for February, or use less and risk spoilage. Too much salt and food becomes hard to eat, too little and it becomes hard to keep. When the brine is mixed, salt, water, perhaps herbs, it stings on cracked knuckles, a small reminder that preservation is work that hurts. Zoom out and you see why salt changes history. It lets a community store larger animals, feed larger crews, travel farther, and stay longer in places where hunting and fishing are uncertain. It turns a seasonal surplus into strategic endurance. But even a well-salted barrel can be defeated by smaller enemies. As the market noise fades behind us, listen for the scratching in the walls and the quiet damp creeping into wood. The next battle is not against hunger, but against rot, and it takes place at home. If you want to understand a Viking farm, don't start with the longhouse. Start with the buildings that aren't meant to be lived in. A small storehouse on stilts stands like a cautious bird above the ground. You climb a narrow ladder, and the wood is slick with frost. Inside, the air is cool and dry, and it carries a tight, mixed perfume, grain dust, smoked fat, old pine, and a faint sour note of fermented dairy. These raised storehouses, found across Scandinavia in later tradition and hinted at in earlier practices, are an answer to a simple question: how do you keep food from moisture and animals? Mice and rats can undo a winter in a week. Damp can undo it in a night. So people build away from the earth, or they bury selectively, root cellars dug into slopes, pits lined with stone or timber, lids sealed with turf. Different foods want different climates. Grain wants dryness. Butter wants cool darkness. Dried fish wants clean airflow. Meat wants smoke and distance from insects. A carpenter who built the storehouse feels pride that is almost parental. Yet he has his own private fear. If the posts rot, he thinks, and the floor sags, the mice will feast and my name will be mocked. In a small community, craftsmanship is memory. Failure is long-lived. Tools matter here: tight-fitting lids, wooden barrels with iron hoops, woven baskets, clay-lined vessels in some regions, even the simple habit of keeping smoke drifting through rafters to discourage pests. Nothing is casual. The best preserved foods are also the most watched. Zoom out and you see a culture trained to think in layers, not just what to store, but where, not just where, but with what seal, not just seal, but who is responsible. That responsibility can be a source of status, or blame. And then there's a stranger preservation method, one that doesn't hide food from decay, but recruits decay as a partner. When the sour smell grows intentional, the next door opens into fermentation. In the corner of the storage space, there's a barrel that no visitor compliments. The lid is weighted down. When it's opened, the smell rises first, sharp, dairy sour, a little like old cheese and wet stone. It makes the eyes narrow. A boy wrinkles his nose and thinks, if I eat this, will I be sick? His stomach argues back, sickness is often just another name for empty. Fermentation is preservation that feels like a dare. But it's also chemistry turned into household routine. Sour whey, leftover from cheesemaking, can become acidic enough to slow harmful spoilage. In parts of the Norse world, especially the North Atlantic settlements, whey and other sour liquids are used to keep foods through winter, bathing meat or fish in a low-oxygen, acidic environment. The result is tangy, sometimes pungent, and undeniably effective when done right. This is not rotting in the lazy sense, it is a managed transformation, as deliberate as salting. The key is control, clean containers, steady temperature, and patience. Open the lid too often and you invite the wrong microbes. Let the barrel sit untouched and it becomes a time capsule. The taste can be startling, a bite that seems to bite back, but it carries calories and salt and protein into months when fresh food is rare. A household leader, perhaps newly Christian and wary of old customs, feels an inner tug. If we abandon what our parents trusted, he thinks, will we look civilized, or simply starve? Identity is not only carved on rune stones, it's swallowed at supper. Zoom out and fermentation becomes a map of adaptation. When settlers reach Iceland, where grain is unreliable, dairy and fish take center stage. When Greenland's margins tighten, every method that stretches food becomes precious. Survival pushes culture into new shapes. But fermented barrels are only half the winter story. You can't live on protein alone, not if you want to work, row, or fight. The next pillar is quieter and more fragile: grain, turned into bread, porridge, and something even more politically useful. The brewing begins. The scent of malt is a soft kind of authority. In a shed or a corner of the longhouse, grain is spread and turned, dampened until it begins to sprout, then dried again over low heat. The air fills with warm, sweet cereal smoke, and for a moment you can forget the darkness outside. This is malting, and it's how you unlock sugar for brewing. Grain is fragile wealth in much of Scandinavia. In some regions barley and rye can thrive, in others the harvest is a gamble. That makes storage almost ceremonial, sacks lifted off the floor, bins kept dry, watchfulness for mold. When grain survives, it becomes porridge, bread, and beer, everyday fuel and social glue. When grain fails, the diet tightens toward fish, dairy, and whatever can be hunted. Beer and mead matter for more than comfort. Feasts, especially around midwinter, the season later remembered as Yule, are political theater in the best sense. A chieftain proves he can feed and entertain. Promises are made over cups. Disputes are softened or sharpened. Loyalty is reinforced by full bellies. A ruler may dream of fame, but his inner conflict is terribly practical. If my hall pours thin ale, he thinks, my rivals will smell weakness like dogs. Zoom out and you can see a winter economy. Grain can be traded, gifted, taxed, demanded. A powerful household collects food rents, then redistributes at feasts to turn stored calories into stored allegiance. In this way, preservation becomes governance. In the hall, you hear it, benches scraped, a ladle tapping a cauldron, the hush before a storyteller begins. Even the candles, tallow, saved from autumn, are proof that someone planned ahead. Yet brewing has its own ticking clock. Ale doesn't last forever. Kegs can sour. Barley can be eaten now or saved for seed. Every decision is a wager placed against weather and warfare. And when the stores are counted and the numbers look tight, another old temptation slides into the mind like a knife into a sheath. If winter will be hard, why not take food from someone else? The shoreline is waiting, and ships are already being caulked. Midwinter arrives without drama, and that is its drama. The world is muffled under snow, the fjord is steel gray, even the trees seem to hold their breath. Inside the longhouse, the air is thick with smoke and bodies. A pot of stew simmers, but the steam rising from it is thinner than it was in November. Someone scrapes the bottom with a wooden spoon and hears the blunt sound of scarcity. This is the season when stored food becomes social truth. Portions are measured. In the dim light, someone counts in silence, 20 fish left on this string, 3 crocks of butter, 1 sack of barley. The tally is done with the same seriousness you'd give a ship's water supply. The best pieces, fat, butter, the last smoked ribs, go to those whose work or status is considered necessary. The lesser bowls go to the young, the old, the enslaved, the unlucky. Hunger is not democratic. It sharpens class lines until they glitter. A local law speaker, the man who recites custom at the thing, feels a cold anxiety that has nothing to do with weather. If people get desperate, he thinks, no oath will hold, no fine will be paid, and every feud will reopen. Law is easier when people are fed. When they are not, the rules begin to feel like decorations. Listen to the hall at night, the crackle of birch in the fire, the soft wheeze of someone sleeping too close to smoke, the tiny crunch as dried fish is chewed like leather. Outside, wolves call from the dark, but the more dangerous predators are inside the human mind: envy, fear, resentment. A single rumor that the storehouse is fuller than it looks can turn neighbors into thieves. Zoom out and you see why Viking society invests so heavily in preservation. It isn't only to survive. It's to prevent winter from dissolving the community into violence. But winter is also an expert at surprise. A warm spell followed by sudden frost can split barrels. A storm can tear a roof. Tonight, as wind begins to worry the thatch, you can feel the next crisis pressing its face against the door. The storm comes in like an uninvited relative, loud, persistent, and impossible to ignore. Snow turns to sleet. Water runs down the turf roof in thin, accusing threads. In the storehouse, a barrel weeps brine through a split stave, and the floorboards darken. Someone lifts a lid and smells it immediately, the sour edge that means the wrong kind of life has begun. In a corner, a sack of barley has clumped with damp. When it's shaken, a faint gray dust rises, more warning than food. Panic here is quiet, because noise wastes breath. A few people work by a tallow lamp, fingers numb, moving meat from one vessel to another, rubbing in extra salt where there is salt to spare, hanging strips closer to the smoke. The fire is stoked until the room hazes. Smoke stings eyes and coats tongues, but it is also a shield against spoilage. A priest, newly part of the landscape in many Norse communities by the late Viking Age, stands at the threshold and feels his own private conflict. Is this God's warning, he thinks, or simply bad carpentry and worse luck? He wants to offer meaning, because meaning calms people. Yet he also knows that meaning doesn't dry meat. He chooses his words carefully, trying to keep faith from becoming fatalism. Zoom out and you see how thin the margin can be. Preservation is not a single act done in autumn, it is maintenance all winter. Barrels must be checked, stores guarded, animals fed, fires tended. One leak, one warm week, one infestation, and the math changes. When the math changes, society changes with it. Debts tighten. Powerful households demand more in exchange for aid. The poor eat first the worst cuts, then the seed grain they should have saved. Mothers dilute stews with water and hope their children don't notice. And beneath all of this, another season is approaching, one that has fooled many into thinking it brings relief. The Vikings call it the hunger gap, when winter stores run low but spring has not yet arrived. As the storm eases, you can already feel that gap opening. By late winter the light returns, but it returns like a debt collector, it reveals what's missing. The snow crust softens by day and freezes again at night, turning paths into slick traps. In the longhouse, people chew more slowly, not from gratitude but from calculation. The stores are nearly spoken of in whispers, as if naming the shortage might make it worse. And this is when ships become arguments. Down by the water, a crew drags a hull onto rollers. The smell of pine tar is thick and medicinal. Men and women work pitch into seams with iron tools, hands black, faces cracked from cold. On the planks, the provisions are sorted for travel, bundles of dried fish, hard flatbread when grain allows, wheels of hard cheese, lumps of salted butter wrapped tight, maybe a small keg of ale that will not keep long but will keep morale. Food for a voyage must be light, durable, and predictable, like a promise you can chew. A young man sharpening an axe feels his own split loyalties. If I stay, he thinks, my mother eats. If I go, my family might eat for years. He is not choosing between peace and violence, he is choosing between two kinds of risk. Raiders are often hungry logisticians in disguise. Zoom out and you can see the cycle. Preservation makes travel possible, and travel brings back what preservation requires: salt, grain, metal, livestock, sometimes people. The Viking world is stitched together by these exchanges, some friendly, some not. When winter presses, the stitches tighten. A poor season on one coast becomes a problem, and an opportunity, on another. This is also why settlements across the North Atlantic are so precarious. A colony that misjudges its stores, or loses a boat, can't simply run to the store. It must either endure, negotiate, or abandon. So the ship is loaded, the sail is checked, the last smoked meat is divided. The shore looks steady, but it is already receding in the mind. In a few days, the crew will push off into grey water, carrying their winter in barrels, and betting their spring on what they can take or trade. Now let's travel farther, to the edge where Viking confidence meets a colder judge, Greenland. Here the air has a different texture, drier, sharper, and the mountains stand like grey teeth against a pale sky. A farm sits on a narrow strip of usable land, and the stored food is not a comfort, it is the settlement's heartbeat. In autumn, Greenlanders slaughter livestock early because fodder is limited. They store meat salted when they can, dried when the wind allows, and they lean heavily on dairy, turning milk into butter and hard curds that keep. Fish and seal are harvested when the sea cooperates. But cooperation is an uncertain thing. As sea ice grows heavier in harsher years, shipping lanes close. Trade with Norway, once the artery bringing iron, timber, and perhaps grain, becomes less reliable. Inside a turf-walled storeroom, a woman breaks a frozen crust on a crock and hears it crack like thin ice. The smell that escapes is strong and sour, she fights the urge to gag, because disgust is a luxury. A man nearby runs his thumb over the last of a salt block and thinks, if this ends, our options end. That is the settlement's inner truth. A local leader, proud, invested, watched, feels the humiliation hovering like a raven. If I admit we're failing, he thinks, I become the man who led us into a white trap. Pride delays decisions. Pride can outlast prudence. Zoom out and you see an irreversible turning point, when preservation is no longer enough to buffer bad years. If storms ruin hay, animals die. If a ship doesn't arrive, tools wear out. If hunters fail, protein thins. Each loss makes the next more likely. The system that carried Vikings across oceans depends on steady inputs. Remove them, and the most skillful storage becomes a slower kind of farewell. Greenland's Norse story ends not with a single catastrophe, but with a series of winters that feel slightly meaner than the last. People leave if they can. Those who cannot, endure until endurance becomes empty. And as the wind combs the snow across abandoned walls, a question lingers into our own age: what do your cupboards mean when the supply lines wobble? The answer, quietly, waits in the methods we inherited. Centuries pass, and the weapons change faster than the pantry. Walk with me into a later dockside warehouse in a Norwegian port. The boards are slick with brine, the air is cold and alive with the smell of dried fish, clean, sharp, almost sweet. Bundles of stockfish are stacked like firewood, and men with ink-stained fingers argue over weights and quality. The Vikings are no longer raiders in this moment, they are ancestors of a commercial habit. The preservation techniques honed for survival become the backbone of trade. Dried cod can travel to cities far from the sea, feeding workers and soldiers. Barrels, simple, brilliant coopered wood, turn liquid and fat into transportable assets. Butter, salted and sealed, becomes a commodity. Even fermentation, once a household strategy, continues in regional foods that outsiders sometimes call acquired tastes, as if endurance were a hobby. A merchant, now operating under kings and church law, feels a conflict that would be familiar to a Viking chieftain. If I squeeze too hard, he thinks, the farmers will hide their best fish. If I'm too generous, I'm ruined. Profit and trust must be balanced the way salt and meat must be balanced, too little and you lose control, too much and you make it inedible. Zoom out and you see something larger. Storage changes how societies think. If you can keep food, you can keep people. You can support craftsmen who don't farm. You can fund voyages. You can sustain a ruler's household and the bureaucracy around it. Preservation is a quiet precondition for complexity. And there is a cultural echo, too. In northern homes even today, smoked meats, cured fish, cultured dairy, and dark breads carry the memory of winters when supermarkets did not exist and storms could cut a community off for weeks. The flavors are history you can chew. But memory is not the same as understanding. To truly feel what Viking storage meant, we need to return to one table, one night, one meal, when winter is deepest and the future is decided mouthful by mouthful. We end where we began, inside the longhouse, with the fire breathing low and steady. It is late winter now, the time when walls seem closer and the world outside feels like a rumor. A pot hangs over the coals, and when the lid is lifted, the steam carries a chorus of stored seasons: smoked lamb, dried fish softened in broth, a knob of butter melted in at the last moment, grain stretched into porridge so it can feed more mouths. The smell is not luxurious, but it is reassuring. It says, someone planned. Someone measured salt, watched smoke, kept lids tight, and chose what to eat now so something would remain later. Around the bench, hands move with a tired rhythm: tear, dip, chew, swallow. The dried fish is tough, but it gives. The fermented bite of sour dairy cuts through fat. Even the bread, dense and dark, feels like a small victory against the cold. A child licks salt from a fingertip, savoring it the way a modern palate savors sugar. An older warrior, shoulders scarred from summers at sea, watches the bowls and feels a conflict he rarely names. I was brave on the water, he thinks, but I fear the quiet fear of an empty larder. Glory is loud, hunger is patient. He understands, at last, that the raids and voyages were only possible because someone, often someone who never held a sword, kept the barrels filled and the smokehouse tended. Zoom out and you see the Viking world in miniature: web of farms and coasts, trade and obligation, technology and weather, all compressed into this meal. Food storage is not a footnote to history, it is one of its engines. It turns summer into winter. It turns a coastline into a corridor. It turns a household into a power. And then, as the fire settles, someone checks the remaining strings of fish, the last crock of butter, the barrel that must last until thaw. Outside, the wind shifts, and somewhere beyond the dark horizon, spring is assembling itself, slowly, inevitably. So when you close your own cupboard tonight, remember the Vikings didn't conquer winter. They negotiated with it, one preserved mouthful at a time, and the negotiation, in its quiet way, is still ongoing.